Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Hey, Freddie, how's it going?
Not too bad, Kelly. How you doing?
Good. Just starting to wind things down for Thanksgiving and looking forward to, gaining 3 to 5 pounds this weekend.
No, you must have a long weekend ahead of you.
Yes. Got a lot of food to eat. Yeah, and I went to a Georgetown basketball game this past weekend. Took my son. It's not our first game, but it's probably the first one that he remembers. It's our first game since pre-COVID. Actually, the Georgetown basketball game was the last live sporting event I saw before COVID, with my son, like 4 days before they shut everything down. But it was a great game. They came back and tied it and ended up winning the game in overtime. So it was a fun event.
Yeah, go Hoyas. It's unusual for us to win anything, so that's great.
Yeah, well, the basketball team is hopefully headed in the right direction. So we'll see. It'll take a little bit of time, but moving in the right direction, I think. So we got a lot to cover today. First, we're going to talk about the outcome of the recent Biden-Xi meeting at the APEC Forum in San Francisco. This is the first meeting in about a year and the second of Biden's presidency. We're also going to look at recent increased violence in Sudan, and then we're going to chat about a couple of elections, one in Argentina and one in Liberia. And then for our deep dive today, we're going to be talking to Margarita Konaev from Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology for an update on the military situation in Ukraine.
Yep, so for our first main story, we have the Biden-Xi summit in San Francisco, which concluded last Wednesday. In a rare sign of easing tensions, the pair agreed on two major points of convergence. High-level military-to-military communication will be resumed, including between theater commanders in the Indo-Pacific, and the two agreed to collaborate on restricting the flow of fentanyl precursor chemicals from China to the Western Hemisphere, which, as we all know, kills upwards of 100,000 Americans each year. So we have those two solid lines of agreement and a few other kind of side deals, more commitments to talk than anything else. So, Kelly, how relieved can we be after this is finished?
I think there's two aspects to this. I think in the near term, this is all very good stuff. In the longer term, though, I don't really see how this changes anything in the larger geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China. Some nice things were said about the Earth being big enough for both powers and all that kind of stuff. But I think in the near term, the agreement to sort of stem the tide of fentanyl related ingredients getting into that China ships out and gets to Mexico and then gets over the border into the U.S. I think that was a big near-term win for the U.S. I think that was something that we wanted going into it, and I think that's good for obvious reasons. The military-to-military reopening of that dialogue is also a good thing. I think that's a win for both sides. I mean, as you guys probably remember, it's been a testy year between the U.S. and China, going back to I guess the real starter for all of this was the balloon incident earlier in the year that happened just before.
And of course, the visit by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan before that as well.
Yes, and and I think that's what actually cut off the military-to-military talks. But then, just as Secretary Blinken was about to go to China, we had this balloon flying over the country that was emanating from China. So so this is all good stuff. I mean, you want to have military-to-military dialogue when you've got issues of freedom of navigation, things going on in the South China Sea. You've got all of the issues that are going on with fishing vessels, whether they be Filipino or Vietnamese in the South China Sea, and just other areas. You want to be able to pick up the phone and talk to the Chinese, so you don't get into an accidental shooting war. So these are all good things, and I think that's going to there's going to be a tamping down, I think, of the rhetoric and a just a lessening of hostility, outwardly at least, for the coming months, because it's beneficial to both sides right now, I think. And from the Chinese perspective, the economic outlooks that we've been seeing coming out of Beijing haven't been that great, and I think she's really not desperate, but is looking for increased foreign direct investment into China. And you saw that he had this really expensive dinner with all these corporate heads and financiers when he was in San Francisco. So he's looking for investment into China. So I think that was another driver on their side to get them to sort of do some of these things and play nice for the moment. Longer term, it doesn't, this doesn't change any of the larger structural issues that are going on in the world and in geopolitics between the US and China. So we'll see how that plays out. I think we've got a window here of playing nice between the two countries. I think, unfortunately, on the US side at least, I think you'll probably see a ratcheting up of negative rhetoric towards China as we move further into next year because of the presidential election. And both sides will probably want to be tough on China. So I think that will happen. But we also might get some pandas back.
We might get
So
some pandas
that's,
back.
yeah. So we'll see. Evidently, she mentioned that at that fancy dinner and got a round of applause when he said that they might loan us more pandas. So, our priorities are in the right place. So there you go.
Absolutely, absolutely. For any listeners who haven't seen, our very own former ambassador Barbara Bodine did an interview with Georgetown on the pandas leaving DC, which they did about a week ago now, and we had a lot of fun doing that with the school. So we've done a lot of panda work here recently. Our priorities really are in line. So next we are moving to Sudan. And the conflict there, which started in April, has been erupting again. So at least 30 people were killed in ethnic militia clashes over the weekend. And this is in the disputed Abyei region between Sudan and South Sudan. The conflict has claimed about 9,000 lives since April, according to the United Nations. And the peace that settled South Sudan's independence in 2011 punted on the issue of the boundaries in this oil-rich Abyei region. And the ethnic tensions have coalesced around the issue as militia groups have begun escalating violence. So, Kelly, what's going on here? Are we likely to see an increase in violence going forward?
So I think the fighting in Sudan right now is something that really needs to be brought to people's attention more than it has been. And that's not to say that, governments in the US in particular aren't paying attention to this and trying to get it to some sort of peaceful conclusion. But I think, wars in other areas right now in Ukraine and in Gaza are eating up a lot of the headlines. And there's really a brewing catastrophe happening in Sudan right now. And this is, as you noted, this kicked off in April. And basically, these two men cooperated to overthrow the government. And then they had a falling out. And they've started to fight between each other for land and territory and resources and everything. And things have gotten a lot worse recently. And so far, there's like 6 million people in Sudan who are internally displaced. The population writ large needs urgent amounts of aid. You'd mentioned thousands have been killed so far to this point. And, this region is not new to violence. I mean, there was 20 years ago, there was the massive atrocities that took place in the Darfur region. So I think this needs to be something that's on people's radar more. There's been efforts by the United States and Saudi Arabia to try to work towards some sort of peace deal. And there was a meeting a couple of weeks ago on that, and nothing came to fruition on that. So, kind of back to the drawing board on that. But I do feel like there's a potential for increased violence in this fighting because of the fact that there's still a lot of militias that have been staying to the side on this and haven't really joined the fray yet. And I think the real danger is if we get actually more forces that are taking part in this and joining the fighting. So I think this is something that we really need to pay attention to in the coming weeks and months.
Next up, we have the recent election in Argentina. Latin America's third largest economy has elected the arch-libertarian Javier Milei, bucking a string of recent elections in the region that saw the election of leftist candidates. There's a lot to unpack here, Kelly. What might Milei's election mean for Argentina and the region more broadly?
Well, that's the $64,000 question floating around right now, and we'll see what this means. I think we've talked on the show recently about wins for advocates of democracy and human rights and the rule of law in places like Poland, but then we this week see that this anarcho-capitalist gets elected in Argentina with a real populist message, libertarian message that has a lot of, some might call them crazy, some would call them drastic ideas on what to do in Argentina. And now, granted, it's surprising that he won, but it's not that surprising considering his opponent was the former economy minister of a country that had 140% inflation rate. So, his prospects weren't looking that good, Milei's opponent to begin with. But he did win by about 12 percentage points. So this was a pretty big win on his part. He doesn't have a lot of experience. He was just elected. He's a former TV personality. He was just elected to Parliament in 2021. But he's really, part and parcel of this up and coming populist, brash politicians. His fans call him the crazy and the wig because, another famous politician, he's got a unique hairstyle, and he refers to himself as the lion. And he has gone to campaign events carrying a running chainsaw. He's also cloned his mastiffs. So he's got dogs that are clones. He's a character, but for the people of Argentina, some 40% of the population lives in poverty. Inflation, as we noted, is huge, and GDP has been shrinking. They do have, quite a few economic issues right now. So Milei's answer to these economic difficulties, though, are pretty drastic. He's calling for the dollarization of the economy and also doing away with most of the country's ministries. So, in order to save money, he's also said that if he raised taxes, he would cut off his arm. Maybe that's what the chainsaw is for. Not sure, but it's going to be something to watch in Argentina in the coming months. He gets inaugurated in early December, so we'll have to see how much he actually follows through with his campaign platform. And there's some tough months coming ahead, I think, for Argentina.
Next up, right before we talk to Rita about Ukraine, we have a small update from a few weeks ago when listeners may remember we covered the first round of Liberia's presidential election. The runoff round took place late last week, and former Vice President Joseph Boakai squeaked through to victory with 50.6% of the vote. Despite irregularities and some counties having to rehold the vote again, former soccer star and current President George Weah called Boakai to concede and gave a rousing speech congratulating the Liberian people on their spirit of democracy. So, Kelly, what does this say about democracy in the western part of Africa then?
So last time we talked about this, we noted that the first round of elections seemed to be run fairly and well done, and I think this speaks very highly and well for democracy in West Africa. I think the fact that Weah conceded defeat is no small thing. Just this morning I was reading something from Semaphore in one of my morning email updates that was showing the length of time and the longest serving heads of state in Africa and their years in power. And it's, goes from like 48 years. And, there's like a dozen that have been in power for years and years and haven't, relinquished power. So just the fact that Weah relinquished power and there was a so far there's been a peaceful transition of power after a democratic election. I think that speaks very well and is, as opposed to some of the other things going on in elections and things, I think that that bodes well for democracy. So that ends our news roundup for today. We're now going to move to our conversation with Margarita Konaev on the latest in Ukraine. Dr. Konaev is Deputy Director of Analysis and a Research Fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, interested in military applications of AI and Russian military innovation. She is also an adjunct senior fellow with the Center for a New American Security. She has previously served as a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point, and she has held post-doctoral fellowships at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts and at the University of Pennsylvania. Let's listen into the conversation. So I'm happy to be joined today by Rita Konaev. And Rita, thanks for joining us to talk about the counteroffensive in Ukraine.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
So, just to kind of, set the bar right away here, there was all this talk going into the spring and summer about this big Ukraine summer counteroffensive. And now that winter's about to set in, how did that counteroffensive fare? Where are we today?
I was just thinking, if we try to understand what were our ambitions and what were the objectives of the counteroffensive, it seems a little bit muddy and entirely unclear what were we expecting realistically, as opposed to what we talked and hoped for. So I think that there was an expectation that there was going to be a single or a couple of really truly massive breakthroughs and significant territorial gains and liberations of cities and areas that were still under Russian occupation. And that once those dominoes began to fall, we would see the Russians being pushed back and Ukraine having a real, operational and even maybe strategic victory on the battlefield. But realistically, I think even looking back, we should have calibrated those expectations and acknowledged the nature of the war as it was looking to be a war of attrition, even already in the summer of 2022. So when we're thinking about whether the counteroffensive been successful or not successful, whether it's dragging on and where as it stands now, when we're nearing the beginning of the third year of the war, I think it was probably, I would score it as maybe a B minus. Perhaps we've seen some territorial gains, especially in the last week, where the Russian forces are being pushed farther away from the banks of the Dnipro River around Kherson, a city that was taken back from the Russians last summer. So we've seen positive developments there. We've also seen progress that Ukraine over the past 6-7 months or so has made in the south, and that the Russian Black Sea Fleet has taken significant damage there. At the same time, I don't want to, draw too much of an optimistic picture because there's still a lot of battlefront and a lot of territory to be liberated from the Russians, and the losses are quite significant and heavy. So to summarize, while there's been some positive developments, especially around Kherson over the last couple of week or so, and overall some real notable progress in the south, there's still a lot of fighting to be done and a lot of territory to liberate.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, as you note, I think we have to temper expectations here. And I think expectations were really high from the outset, and people were expecting some sort of like D-Day invasion that was just going to continuously push the Russians back. And just because that hasn't happened doesn't mean that this counteroffensive has failed. It just kind of demonstrates that this is going to be a longer slog than a lot of people thought or hoped for. On that point, as far as aid has gone from the Allied side, or the Western side, from your perspective, has the West been giving the right sort of support, enough support? And then on the flip side of that, there's the Russians have agency here too, right? It's not all about the Ukrainians. So what have the Russians been doing to create a more difficult situation for the counteroffensive to be successful?
Yeah. So, on the question of Western support, I want to say two things that I think are important. First of all, it should be clear, and I believe it is clear to everyone, that without continued and committed Western support, Ukraine really faces very difficult odds. So it is imperative that the West, with the leadership of the United States, continues to support Ukraine and provide it with everything it needs, from continued ammunition to advanced missile systems and air defense systems and electronic warfare capabilities, drones, you name it. It's both a high-tech war and an old school war, and as such it requires a really broad set of capabilities. The second point here is to say that while the West has been providing this essential support, it has almost, I don't want to say inevitably, but understandably has been to understandably to an extent has been delivered gradually, because some of that supply is conditioned by the political conditions at home in each country, including the United States, as well as, the vitality of the defense industrial base and our own ability to provide what we need to provide to Ukraine. Then there's the whole notion of, just it takes a long time to get something into the field, and then to maintain it and to resupply it. These are all things that, there's whenever there's such massive logistical elements involved, it inevitably takes time. And the other thing here that I think is also critical to understand is that when the real, massive investments in supporting Ukraine began, and with the delivery of the aid that was coming in, I think there was an assumption that this is not going to be a long-term adventure. I think there was an assumption that Russia cannot sustain both the pace and the scale of this war, and that Russia is going to, one way or another, capitulate and retreat. And I believe that that really conditioned the Western approach to supporting Ukraine. But as the situation on the ground showed a different reality, the adjustments that needed to be made were not perhaps made as fast or as significantly in scope as they might have been able to. So that's on the Ukrainian and the Western side. On the Russian side, again, the assumption that Russia cannot sustain a disastrous war is just not correct, in my opinion. And I say this often because I think especially the public in the West and the American perception really needs to understand something. And that is, just because something is going terribly doesn't mean it has to end. It can very much continue. And the decision to fight a disastrous war, to lose ground, to lose massive numbers of people, personnel, and equipment, it's a political decision in the end of the day. And as long as this war is easier for Putin to maintain than taking a loss and retreating, which is politically unsustainable for him and unrealistic, I think we need to understand that Russia will stay in this fight, even if it is economically ruinous, and even if it is continuing to suffer massive casualties, as long as it's necessary for Putin to stay in it.
And there, and another aspect too, I think about this, when you talk about the provision of aid and everything too, that people don't take into account is like, if you send an M1A1 Abrams tank, Ukrainians don't know how to use that. So there's the training issue and the months and months it takes to train people on this sort of thing before they can actually use it, and on these new weapon systems that we're sending over and stuff too. So on that, I know there's been a large element of intel sharing as well on the side, on the American side and the Western European allies side, giving this intel to Ukraine. So what have you seen there, and how important has that been, along with sort of this training, not only on these new weapon systems, but also just training in how to fight?
Yeah, for sure. So I think training has been significant and useful, but we also have to. What you said is correct. It takes a long time to train people, especially on the more sophisticated and complex systems. Even though that we've heard from the people who have trained the Ukrainians that they are very quick learners, that they came already with incredible ground knowledge from the ground, and they adjust and they adapt and they learn exceptionally quickly, much faster than people would probably learn under peacetime conditions. But we also kind of have to keep in mind that Ukraine is taking a great deal of casualties, and a lot of the people that are been trained by the United States and its allies lose their lives in the fighting. So the training has to be continuous. It's not really sustainable to just train one group, especially the type of elite soldiers that are on the front lines and are at the helm of the fighting. So that's the one side on the training. On the intelligence sharing, I think that has been absolutely significant and pivotal in just at the tactical and operational level at the conduct of the war. And I think it also taught us a very important lesson about if there is a will, there is a way when it comes to intelligence sharing. I think there's been real problems before, both, for the United States with its allies and partners, and even across NATO, just to be able to declassify things on time and to communicate effectively across different levels of classification. And it seems, at least from what I've been reading and keeping up with, that on things like identifying Russian positions in the field and identifying, targeting information and troops movements and things of that nature, that there's been quite effective and equally important, timely intelligence sharing, which means that if we are, if there's enough trust, if there's then the systems for intelligence sharing can really develop and be very, very useful.
So you focus a lot in your research and in your work on sort of emerging tech in warfare and things of those nature. So we'll get you out of here on this last question. What have you seen over the last year and a half, and specifically as the counteroffensive has moved forward over the past summer? What have you seen from sort of new tech or from a technological standpoint? I love the phrase you said earlier about it's both a high tech war and an old school war. So how have we seen those two things sort of come together in the past year and a half?
Yeah, so this is a bit of an evolving question for me, because when I got asked that question about, in the early months of the war, about half a year in, I had a bit of like, I was a bit skeptical, especially when it comes to the things that I work on, which is artificial intelligence, military applications of artificial intelligence, because there was really not a lot of information about how, if at all, AI might is being deployed on the battlefield. And the examples that we were hearing for things like AI for facial recognition, or AI for interception of communications, the examples were scarce, but they were repeated constantly. So it created an impression that, AI was being employed a lot, but truthfully, it was only a few examples. With time, perhaps maybe a year and a half and into the second year of the war, you got more information about AI being used for in real ways for intelligence and information processing, and the ability to collate and bring together and analyze data from different sources and different sensors and different types of data. So this type, leveraging AI for intelligence fusion, and we saw that definitely more on the Ukrainian side with the help of American companies, seemed to be an area where AI, at least in its more modern interpretation, was being used seemingly more effectively. But when it comes to really the high end, the emerging technology side of this war, I think, and we talk about this a lot, the role of drones can really not be underestimated. And there's a lot to say about what are the drones doing, whether they're being used for a whole range of missions, from intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to providing information to artillery teams on the ground, this real type of combination of capabilities, and even being deployed in what looks like swarms. But at the same time, I think it's also really important to remember that the absolute majority of those drones are being remotely operated, so they're not autonomous. So we've seen massive breakthroughs in AI over the last couple of years, and it's very likely that we will see the evolution and progress in AI as both sides and the allies of Ukraine get more and more battlefield data and have the opportunity to experiment and develop additional solutions. And so that's something that the Ukrainians have been really incredible with. So from where I see it, I think it's going to continue to evolve, but it's really difficult to judge at this point whether it has had a really, definitely not decisive, but it's difficult to tell what kind of an impact it had on the conduct of the war so far.
Yeah, it's an interesting time because we've got this moment where you've got all these advances in AI happening, and you've got a war that's going on at the same time with or between powers or countries that have sort of technological know-how and savvy and equipment to sort of put these into play. So I think it's going to, as you said, I think it's an evolving field of where this ends up. But all right. Rita Konaev, thank you so much for joining us, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
This episode was produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett Dang. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @geodiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.